Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Sci-fi Stories. We truly appreciate your ongoing support. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without a budget to keep operating. If you enjoy the story today, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to sustain their lives and continue creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments of this video. The walls of the cell did not echo. They breathed. Ashton Baker pressed his metallic left arm against the moist, pulsating flesh of his prison, feeling the rhythmic heartbeat of a dying world beneath his synthetic fingertips. He was supposed to be dead, recycled into nutrient paste for the Xyloc hive. Instead, he was about to receive a proposal that would turn the entire alien empire inside out. The air inside the holding chamber was thick, smelling of copper and decaying flora. Ashton leaned heavily against the biological membrane that served as a wall, his chest heaving as he tried to regulate his breathing. Every inhale brought a wave of nausea. He was a mercenary, a man accustomed to the sterile, cold steel of human starships and the sharp scent of ozone. Here, engulfed in the damp, fleshy bowels of the Xyloc homeworld, his senses were drowning. His physical body was battered, covered in deep lacerations from the ambush that had ruined his sabotage mission. Worse still, the internal heads-up display behind his retinas flashed a persistent crimson warning. His cybernetic enhancements were operating on a mere 5% power capacity. The microservos in his left arm whined with a pitiful grind every time he clenched his fist. He had failed. His squad was gone. And he was the sole survivor, waiting to be tossed into the infamous biological recycling pool. He expected the floor to open and drop him into a vat of digestive acids. Instead, the sphincter-like door of his cell contracted and snapped open. Two massive guards stepped inside. They were hideous amalgamations of reptilian scales and primate muscle. Their eyes completely milked over, slaved directly to the planetary hive mind. They did not speak. They simply grabbed Ashton by his shoulders with crushing force and dragged him out into the corridor. The corridors were not built. They were grown. Veins the size of human torsos pulsed with bioluminescent fluid, casting a sickly green glow over the fleshy pathways. Ashton dragged his heavy boots across the yielding floor, conserving his rapidly depleting battery. They did not lead him down toward the processing vats. They hauled him upward, toward the central operation room, the neural nexus of the entire sector. The doors parted to reveal a sprawling chamber suspended over a glowing abyss. Thick, glowing nerve roots cascaded from the ceiling like a weeping willow, connecting directly into the spine of a singular figure, resting on a throne of living cartilage. Queen Xyloc was a terrifying vision of lethal elegance. Unlike her monstrous guards, she possessed a lithe, almost humanoid silhouette, draped in chitinous plating that shimmered like polished obsidian. Her face was sharply angled, beautiful, but entirely devoid of warmth. She did not have eyes, only a smooth, iridescent visor of dark sensory tissue. She was the anchor of the planetary telepathic network, capable of shattering a mind with a single thought. The guards threw Ashton to his knees. He looked up, his jaw set, refusing to show the agonizing pain shooting through his broken ribs. "You are broken, human." The Queen spoke. Her voice did not travel through the air. It manifested directly inside his skull, a chilling, harmonic resonance that made his teeth ache. "Your machinery is dying. Your flesh is failing. By all our laws, you are nothing but organic waste." Anik. Ashton spat a mouthful of blood onto the pristine, pearlescent floor. "Then throw me in the vat and get it over with. I have a better use for you," the Queen projected, her tone slicing through his mind like cold glass. "You will not die today. You will become a biological sacrifice to the High Court. Or you will marry my daughter." Ashton blinked. the absurdity of the statement momentarily overriding his pain. "Run that by me again. Did you just propose on behalf of your kid?" The queen remained perfectly still, but the ambient light in the room flared aggressively. "Do not test my patience, scavenger. My empire teeters on the edge of collapse. The noble factions grow arrogant. They plot treason in the psychic shadows, thinking I cannot hear their whispers. They despise your kind. The Xyloc view humanity as a cosmic disease. Your minds are chaotic, loud, and utterly repugnant to our telepathic senses. Your metal implants act as dense, impenetrable static. You are psychically blind." "I call it having privacy," Ashton grunted, shifting his weight. "I call it a weapon," the queen corrected. "Your psychic blindness and your savage, primitive instinct for survival are exactly what I require. I need a monster to place in the halls of my enemies, a creature they cannot read, cannot control, and cannot understand. By marrying my widowed daughter, you will become a prince of the hive. Your very presence will be an insult, a terror, and a blunt instrument to keep the nobles in line." Ashton stared at her, his tactical mind racing despite the exhaustion. He was being used as a pawn. He was a cheap, terrifying mask the queen intended to wear to scare her rivals. But beneath the layers of political manipulation and alien royalty, Ashton was a survivor. A human mercenary did not care about the politics of a fleshy world. He only cared about the next breath. "I accept," Ashton said, his voice raspy but steady. The queen tilted her head, a gesture of mild surprise. "You do not ask about the risks. You do not ask about the bride." "I do not care," Ashton replied, forcing himself to stand, his cybernetic leg whining in protest. "I want to live. That makes me your perfect monster. But before I meet the princess, we have a deal to adjust." He raised his dead, heavy metallic arm, fixing his gaze on the alien matriarch. "I need a charging port," Ashton demanded. "Give me enough electricity to get my arm back to 100%, and I will gladly ruin the lives of every noble in your court." The queen observed him in profound silence. Then, a slow, terrifying smile parted her chitinous lips. She had chosen perfectly. The human did not know how to be afraid. The cleansing process was agonizing, a brutal erasure of his humanity. The royal attendant submerged Ashton into a shallow vat of translucent, stinging biological solvent. It burned away the grime, the dried blood, and the harsh scent of human sweat, replacing it with a sterile, almost chemical odor that made his nose twitch uncontrollably. When they hauled him out, his skin was raw, burning with a furious heat. But his open wounds had been sealed tightly by a rapidly hardening bioresin. Next came the ceremonial armor. It was not forged from steel or assembled with bolts. It was woven directly onto his body. The molecular scales felt like a second skin, incredibly light, yet deeply suffocating. As if the suit itself was a living entity, constantly adjusting its grip on his weary muscles. His fully charged cybernetic arm hummed with a low, reassuring vibration beneath the alien plating, the only familiar sensation he had left. He was led down a silent, spiraling corridor that felt drastically different from the organic, pulsating chaos of the lower levels. The fleshy walls here were muted, pale, and cold to the touch, resembling calcified bone rather than living tissue. The heavily armored guards stopped before a circular door that dissolved inward like a dying breath, revealing a dimly lit, expansive chamber. Princess Lyra stood completely still in the center of the room. She was nothing like the terrifying matriarch who ruled this world from the neural nexus, where the queen was an imposing monolith of dark chitin and absolute authority. Lyra possessed a fragile, withered beauty. Her pale skin seemed almost translucent in the low light, mapped with faint blue veins, and her eyes were a haunting, empty silver. She was draped in a morning gown woven from strands of dormant optical fibers. The heavy material hung off her slight frame like a shroud of dead stars, utterly devoid of the bioluminescence that defined her species and their deep connection to the planet. She did not look at him when he entered. Her gaze remained fixed on an empty, shadowed corner of the room. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until the doors sealed shut behind him, leaving the two outcasts completely alone in the sprawling suite. "So," Lyra finally spoke. Her voice was dry and brittle, completely devoid of the terrifying psychic resonance her mother possessed. "This is the crude instrument my mother has chosen to wield. A scavenger. A broken, half-machine abomination dripping with the stench of a dead world." Ashton did not immediately reply. He stood near the entrance, his human eye and optical sensor coldly sweeping the perimeter. He was not looking at her fragile beauty or assessing her profound grief. His mind was entirely occupied with analyzing the structural integrity of the vaulted ceiling, the intersecting angles of the pale walls, and the potential entry points hidden in the architectural design. Lyra slowly turned her head, her silver eyes narrowing with unconcealed contempt. "Did you not hear me, human? Or is your mechanical hearing as defective as your pathetic species? You think you can wear that royal armor and stand where he stood? My husband was a paragon of the high courts. He was elegant, brilliant, and pure. He was everything you will never be." "And now he is dead," Ashton stated flatly, his voice devoid of any emotion. The words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. She recoiled slightly, her hands clenching into tight, trembling fists at her sides. "He did not die in battle," she hissed, her voice shaking with a potent mixture of rage and profound helplessness. The nobles did not have the courage to face him physically. They tore his mind apart. A psychic assassination. 100 telepathic blades piercing his consciousness at once. And I could do nothing but watch his physical body seize, hemorrhage, and break. She took a step closer, the dead optical fibers of her heavy dress rustling like dry leaves on stone. "I am a null, a genetic anomaly in a world of telepaths. I cannot hear the network, and I cannot project my thoughts. I had to stand there, completely deaf and blind to the psychic slaughter, while the man I loved was shredded from the inside out. And now, my mother insults his memory by chaining me to a piece of scrap metal who cannot even comprehend the war we are fighting." Ashton met her hateful glare with absolute indifference. He did not offer pity. He did not attempt to defend his honor or his humanity. Instead, he took 3 measured steps to his left, moving fluidly out of the direct line of sight from the main doorway, and pointed a rigid synthetic finger toward the vaulted ceiling. "There are 4 ventilation shafts in this chamber, large enough to fit an armed assassin," Ashton said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that cut through her emotional outburst. "The main door is thick, but the locking mechanism relies on a centralized neural pulse, which means it can be bypassed remotely by anyone with enough access. You are standing perfectly illuminated in the exact center of the room, offering a clear line of sight from any of those 4 entry points. If a physical kill squad breaches this room right now, you will be dead in exactly 3 seconds." Lyra froze, the venom dying instantly on her lips as deep confusion washed over her pale face. "Your husband was noble," Ashton continued, stepping further into the shadows, blending with the darkness. "He was elegant. He was pure. That is exactly why they killed him. He trusted the rules of his court. He believed in the sanctity of his high position. He died because he did not know how to think like prey." He turned to face her fully, the microservos in his metallic arm whining faintly as he gestured to the room around them. "I am not here to replace your husband. I am not here to hold your hand or care about your grief. I am here because I know how to survive in the dark. I check the corners. I count the exits. I constantly expect the knife in the back. Your husband's nobility got him slaughtered like livestock. My paranoia is the only thing that is going to keep both of us breathing until tomorrow morning." The naked, brutal reality of his words stripped away the very last remnants of her royal indignation. Lyra stared at the human mercenary, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time since he walked in, she did not look at his cybernetics with disgust. She saw the cold, hyper-calculating posture of a predator perfectly adapted to a violent, unforgiving universe. The psychological shock was profound and immediate. He was a crude, emotionless tool. But as she looked nervously at the shadowed corners he had just pointed out, she realized he was the exact tool she desperately needed. The insult of his presence faded completely, rapidly replaced by a chilling, clear realization of his absolute utility. The grand cathedral of the hive was a cavernous dome of pulsating bioluminescence and sharp, jagged obsidian pillars. It was not a place of celebration. It was an arena. Hundreds of Xyloc noble lords lined the terraced balconies, their chitinous armor gleaming in the sickly violet light. The air in the chamber was incredibly dense, thick with an atmospheric pressure that had nothing to do with gravity. It was the physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated malice. The nobles were projecting a collective telepathic killing, intent so powerful it made the ambient temperature drop and caused the very air molecules to vibrate with a low, sickening hum. Ashton and Lyra walked side by side down the central aisle, surrounded by a silence so heavy it felt like drowning. There would be no spoken vows. There would be no rings exchanged. Xyloc matrimony was forged through the neural membrane fusion, a brutal psychic binding conducted at the epicenter of the planetary network. At the end of the aisle stood the source tree, a massive, ancient column of exposed nerve endings and glowing sap that connected directly to the core of the planet. Lyra walked with the stiff, mechanical grace of a corpse. She knew what was waiting for them. As a null, the telepathic hostility washing over the room was invisible to her, but she could read the aggressive posture of the nobles, leaning over the balconies. They were waiting for a slaughter. They reached the base of the source tree. A high priest, a creature more fungal than flesh, gestured toward the glowing, weeping bark with a multi-jointed appendage. "Bind the flesh. Fuse the network," the priest commanded, its voice echoing in the physical space rather than the mental one. An accommodation for the deaf human and the blind princess. Lyra reached out first. She pressed her pale, delicate hand against the pulsing nerve cluster. Nothing happened. The tree did not react to her touch. She was a void in their beautiful tapestry, completely isolated from the profound connection of her species. She withdrew her hand and looked at Ashton, her silver eyes completely devoid of hope. It was his turn. Ashton stepped forward. He did not use his synthetic limb. He raised his real, flesh and blood, right hand and pressed his palm flat against the warm, oozing surface of the source tree. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. The moment his skin made contact with the planetary neural fluid, the noble lord struck. It was not a physical assault. It was a localized psychic thermonuclear detonation. A tsunami of telepathic violence slammed into Ashton's consciousness. The sensation was agonizingly physical. It felt as though hundreds of invisible, razor-sharp spikes were being hammered directly through his eye sockets, tearing deep into the soft tissue of his frontal lobe. His vision instantly whited out. The taste of copper flooded his mouth as capillaries in his sinuses ruptured under the immense, invisible pressure. The nobles were not trying to read him. They were trying to completely annihilate his mind, intending to leave him a drooling, brain-dead husk on the altar to prove the absolute superiority of the hive and humiliate the queen. They wanted to crush the human anomaly right here, in front of the entire court. Ashton dropped to one knee. His jaw locked so tightly, his teeth threatened to shatter. Blood began to stream from his nose, painting his chin crimson. Up in the balconies, the noble lords leaned closer, their featureless faces emanating waves of smug, telepathic triumph. They thought he was breaking. They thought his silence was submission. They were wrong. Deep within the architecture of Ashton's brain, nestled against his cerebral cortex, his military-grade cybernetic implant registered a critical, hostile intrusion. It was a safeguard designed to prevent enemy hackers from hijacking his motor functions. But a neural network was just another kind of web. Through the blinding agony, Ashton forced a single, jagged thought to his neural interface. He bypassed the firewall and manually initiated the tactical feedback loop protocol. "You want to see my mind?" Ashton ground out through clenched, bloody teeth, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "Take a good look." He threw the gates open. He did not block the telepathic connection. He weaponized it. He dumped the entire encrypted archive of human history and his own deeply traumatizing combat logs directly into the undefended, pristine telepathic network of the Zilok nobles. He fed them Earth. In a fraction of a second, the collective consciousness of the Zilok aristocracy was violently flooded with the raw, unfiltered horror of humanity. They experienced the blinding flash and subsequent skin-melting heat of thermonuclear detonations. They felt the crushing, suffocating terror of trench warfare, the deafening roar of continuous artillery barrages, and the chaotic, visceral panic of hand-to-hand combat in burning cities. Ashton did not just show them images. The psychic link forced them to feel the emotions attached to those memories. The malice, the sheer brutality, the infinite capacity for cruelty, and the terrifying, bottomless desperation of a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other. And beneath it all, acting as a carrier wave for the trauma, Ashton broadcasted an unfiltered audio file of cosmic microwave background radiation, played at 120 decibels, directly into their linked minds. It was the screaming, chaotic static of a dead universe, the ultimate antithesis to their harmonious, ordered network. The reaction in the Grand Cathedral was immediate and devastating. The smug, telepathic pressure vanished, replaced instantly by a chaotic symphony of physical agony. High up on the balconies, a noble lord suddenly shrieked, a horrific gurgling sound, and clawed frantically at his own sensory visor. He collapsed over the railing, his body violently seizing. Then another fell, and another. Across the cavernous hall, dozens of the most powerful telepaths on the planet were dropping to the floor. They were curled into tight fetal positions, clutching their heads as thick, viscous blue blood violently hemorrhaged from their facial orifices and the delicate membranes behind their ears. The pure, chaotic violence of the human psyche was acting like a corrosive acid within their highly sensitive, unified hive mind. They could not process the static. They could not endure the trauma. The high priest stumbled backward from the altar, dropping to its knees, its fungal body trembling in absolute terror. Ashton slowly stood up. The excruciating pressure in his skull was gone. He severed the connection, pulling his bloodied right hand away from the source tree. A deathly, suffocating silence descended upon the Grand Cathedral. The only sounds remaining were the ragged, gasping breaths of the crippled noble lords, and the heavy, rhythmic dripping of blue blood pooling on the obsidian floor. The ambient bioluminescence of the room had flickered and dimmed, reacting to the massive psychic shockwave. The contempt was gone. It had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a suffocating, primal dread. The surviving nobles stared down at the lone human standing at the altar. They finally understood what the queen had done. She had not brought a pet into their court. She had invited a plague. She had bound them to a living weapon of psychological mass destruction. Ashton wiped the stream of red blood from his chin with the back of his synthetic hand. He turned to face the terrified audience of bleeding aristocrats. His posture was perfectly relaxed, as if he had just finished a casual stroll. He looked up at the devastated balconies, his eyes scanning the carnage he had just inflicted, with nothing more than his own memories. Then Ashton smiled. It was a bright, terrifyingly wide smile, stretching his lips over his teeth in a perfect imitation of joy. But it was entirely lifeless. There was no warmth in his eyes, only the cold, calculating void of a predator asserting absolute dominance. With that single, horrifying expression, the bloody alliance was officially sealed. The heavy, cartilaginous doors of the bridal suite sealed shut with a final, wet hiss. The absolute silence that followed was heavy. No longer the menacing quiet of the cathedral, but the claustrophobic stillness of a tomb. The chamber was expansive and disgustingly opulent. A massive, circular bed composed of woven, bioluminescent silk and plush. Breathing moss dominated the center of the room. Warm. Amber light filtered through translucent membranes on the ceiling, casting long, deceptive shadows across the floor. Ashton did not even glance at the bed. The moment the locking mechanism engaged, his demeanor shifted from the cold, theatrical arrogance he had displayed at the altar to the hyper-focused intensity of a soldier in hostile territory. He moved with a sudden, startling swiftness. Lyra stood near the entrance, her hands clasped tightly together, watching in bewildered silence as her new husband began to systematically tear the royal suite apart. He approached a cluster of vibrant, glowing flora arranged elegantly on a pedestal. Without a single moment of hesitation, his synthetic fingers plunged into the soil, ripping the plants out by their roots. He squeezed the thick, fibrous stems, his optical sensor scanning the glowing sap. He tossed the ruined plants aside and moved to a decorative wall, hanging, tearing it down and feeling along the organic seams. "What are you doing?" Lyra demanded, her voice a fragile whisper in the vast room. Ashton ignored her. He stepped up to a sculpted, bone-like vanity and drove his metallic fist straight through the center of a large, decorative fungal bloom. He pulled his hand back, opening his palm. Resting in the center of his synthetic palm was a small, fleshy node, no larger than a human fingernail. It possessed tiny, pulsating veins and a microscopic visual cortex. With a sickening squelch, Ashton crushed it between his thumb and forefinger. He moved again, faster this time. He checked the underside of a seating cushion and ripped out a second node. He climbed onto the edge of the massive bed, reached up to the glowing canopy, and forcefully extracted a third. He dropped the 3 crushed biological surveillance devices onto the pale floor right in front of Lyra. 3 independent sensory transmitters, Ashton stated, his voice flat and professional. Soft tissue construction, engineered to bypass standard perimeter sweeps by mimicking ambient biological signatures. The nobles were going to watch us, listen to us, and monitor your vital signs while we slept. They are already deeply embedded inside your most secure royal quarters. Lyra stared down at the ruined bugs, her silver eyes widening, the last remnants of her royal composure, the icy facade she had maintained since the death of her husband, finally shattered. Her shoulders slumped, and a deep, shuddering breath escaped her lips. She slowly lowered herself, ignoring the luxurious furniture, and sat directly on the cold, hard floor. "I do not know who to trust anymore," Lyra confessed, her voice breaking. "Every meal I eat, every corridor I walk down, I am constantly terrified. They poisoned my husband's mind, and I know they are trying to poison mine. I lie awake every night, waiting for the invisible knife in the dark." Ashton watched her for a long moment. He understood that kind of exhaustion perfectly. It was the bone-deep weariness of a hunted animal. He walked over and sat down on the floor facing her, keeping a tactical distance but placing himself between her and the main door. He raised his cybernetic left arm and engaged a hidden mechanical latch near his elbow. A seamless plate slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Using his flesh and blood hand, Ashton carefully extracted 4 tiny, metallic discs. They were no larger than coins, but their dense, heavy casing indicated their lethal nature. Micro-directional explosive charges, Ashton explained, meticulously placing the first disc near the base of the main door. Filled with high-velocity tungsten ball bearings. They are purely mechanical, no neural link, no wireless signal, and completely invisible to any telepathic scan. He placed the remaining 3 charges at precise angles around their perimeter, creating a lethal, overlapping kill zone. He activated them with a manual, physical twist. A faint, nearly imperceptible red light blinked on each device before fading to black. "The room is secure," Ashton said, settling back against the wall. "If anything tries to open that door or breach the ventilation, these charges will instantly reduce them to a fine mist. We have established a completely analog safe zone." Lyra looked at the lethal human technology, and for the first time, a genuine, albeit weary, sense of relief washed over her features. She pulled her knees to her chest, the dead optical fibers of her morning dress wrapping around her like a shield. "You humiliated them today," Lyra said softly, her silver eyes meeting his gaze. "But that humiliation will only make them more desperate. The nobles are incredibly powerful, but their greatest strength is also their fatal flaw. They rely entirely on the collective. They act as a swarm. A single noble is terrified of isolation. They draw their courage, their tactical planning, and their very identity from the constant, unbroken connection to their peers." Ashton nodded slowly, processing the strategic intelligence. "A hive mind. They move as one. But if you introduce chaos into the network, they cannot function independently." "Exactly," Lyra confirmed. "They have never fought an enemy who fights alone." Ashton leaned forward, the ambient light casting sharp angles across his scarred face. "I promised your mother I would be a monster to scare her enemies. I told you I would keep us breathing, but a shield only delays the inevitable." He reached out, his metallic fingers lightly tapping the cold floor between them. "I am not going to just sit here and block their attacks," Ashton promised, his voice a lethal, low rumble. "I am going to find the weakest link in their network, and I am going to become the blade that cuts their collective throat. We are going to bleed them." A profound, tactical understanding passed between the human mercenary and the alien princess. Sitting on the cold floor of a rigged bridal suite, surrounded by the threat of assassination, a genuine alliance of survival was officially cemented in the dark. The morning cycle brought no sunlight to the subterranean capital, only a shift in the bioluminescence from a dormant amber to a piercing, clinical white. The diplomatic banquet was a mandatory theater, a formalized gathering demanded by the ancient treaties of the Hive. It was held in the sunken pavilion, a vast amphitheater of carved bone and flowing, iridescent liquids. Ashton sat at the right hand of Princess Lyra, heavily armored and entirely unamused. Across the expansive, circular table sat Lord Vale, the undisputed orchestrator of the noble faction. Vale was massive, his armor a jagged display of deep crimson chitin, his sensory visor practically vibrating with arrogant, barely contained malice. "It is a fascinating paradox," Lord Vale projected, his telepathic voice loud enough to resonate in the physical air of the pavilion, a deliberate show of power. He swirled a goblet of thick, luminescent nectar. "We observed your performance at the altar. Human. You possess a loud, chaotic mind, but your physical form is tragically pathetic. You have no natural armor. You lack the venomous glands of the lower castes. Half of your body has been replaced by crude, sparking metals because your native flesh is too weak to sustain itself. You are a fragile, decaying thing." Ashton cut a piece of synthetic protein from his plate, using his standard-issue combat knife, completely ignoring the insult. He chewed slowly, his single human eye fixed on Vale, with the dead, unblinking stare of a shark. In our culture, a new prince must demonstrate his physical fortitude to the court, Vile continued, setting his goblet down. His voice dripped with lethal intent. A mere formality, of course. A traditional test of your reflexes. I brought a gift for the royal menagerie, a predator from the deep shadow zones. Vile gestured with a clawed hand. At the far end of the pavilion, a heavy containment door slid open. Nothing came out. At least, nothing visible to the naked eye. But the atmosphere in the room instantly plummeted. The ambient bioluminescence flickered wildly, reacting to a sudden, massive displacement of psychic energy. A wave of localized dread washed over the banquet table. Queen Xyloc, seated at the head of the table, stiffened, her hands gripping the armrests of her throne tightly enough to crack the bone. Lyra froze beside Ashton, her breath catching in her throat. She could not sense the creature telepathically, but she recognized the sudden, terrified silence of the noble lords around them. Vile had released a mind stalker. It was an apex biological weapon, a creature engineered to be optically invisible by bending light around its translucent hide. Its primary method of hunting, however, was not physical. It emitted a concentrated frequency of psychic terror that paralyzed the nervous system of its prey, turning their brains to mush before it even took a bite. To any biological entity in the room, it was a walking death sentence. The queen projected a sharp, commanding pulse of anger. "Vile! You dare bring that abomination into the royal pavilion?" "It is merely a beast, my queen," Vile replied, his face a mask of feigned innocence, though his physical body was practically vibrating with anticipation. If the human is truly worthy of his title, he has nothing to fear. The Mindstalker was already in the room. The nobles leaned back in their chairs, their featureless faces turned away, trying to shield their own minds from the ambient terror radiating from the beast. Lyra reached under the table, her pale, trembling hand gripping Ashton's heavy metallic knee. She was preparing for him to seize, to scream, to die right next to her, just like her husband did. But Ashton did not scream. He did not move a single muscle. The paralyzing psychic wave slammed into his consciousness, and his military-grade neural implant instantly categorized it as a low-level auditory hallucination. He simply engaged his cognitive noise cancellation filter. The terrifying mental screech became nothing more than a dull, annoying hum in the back of his skull. "You talk too much, Val," Ashton said evenly. Beneath his artificial skin, his cybernetic eye whirred softly. He bypassed his standard optical spectrum and manually toggled his visual input to thermal imaging. The world shifted from clinical white to deep blues and purples. And right there, creeping silently across the center of the massive banquet table, perfectly aligned with Ashton's chest, was a vibrant, glowing red and orange heat signature. It was the size of a large predatory feline, composed of sleek, rippling muscles and a jaw unhinging to reveal rows of thermal hotspots that looked suspiciously like razor-sharp teeth. It was preparing to leap. Ashton did not tense. He did not give away a single micro-expression of alarm. He waited until the thermal signature gathered its weight on its hind legs, closing the distance to a mere 3 feet. With a burst of motion so fast it blurred, Ashton's right hand shot down to the side of his armored boot. He ripped a high-frequency, superheated tactical shortsword from its concealed magnetic sheath. The blade ignited with a violent hiss, glowing a blinding, incandescent orange. He did not swing blindly. He thrust the superheated blade directly upward and forward into the seemingly empty air above the centerpieces. A horrifying, gurgling shriek tore through the physical air of the pavilion, shattering the silence. The optical camouflage of the Mindstalker violently destabilized. The creature materialized exactly where Ashton had struck. It was a grotesque, multi-limbed nightmare of translucent flesh. Ashton's glowing sword was driven straight up through the bottom of the beast's lower jaw, piercing through its brainpan and pinning its heavy skull directly to the thick, fibrous wood of the banquet table with a sickening crunch. Hot, viscous, pitch-black blood erupted from the wound. The immense pressure of the kill shot sent a thick spray of the boiling fluid straight across the table, splattering heavily against Lord Vale's crimson armor and searing across his sensory visor. The beast thrashed wildly for exactly 2 seconds before its central nervous system collapsed. It went completely limp, a smoking, dead mass of meat nailed to the center of the royal table. The pavilion descended into absolute, paralyzed shock. Lord Vael recoiled, frantically wiping the smoking black blood from his face, his telepathic arrogance completely annihilated by the sheer, sudden violence of the physical world. Ashton did not stand up. He calmly reached across the table, gripped the hilt of his sword, and wrenched it free with a wet tearing sound. He casually grabbed a heavily embroidered cloth napkin and began to wipe the boiling blood from his blade. "Your fundamental problem, Vale," Ashton stated, his voice cutting through the dead silence like a scalpel, "is that you think evolution is a psychic game? My ancestors did not conquer a toxic death trap of a planet by reading each other's feelings. We dominated it through superior engineering, metallurgical science, and the application of absolute, overwhelming physical violence. Your parlor tricks are useless against a species that practically invented blunt force trauma." He tossed the bloody napkin onto the dead creature's snout and slammed his sword back into its sheath. Lyra did not miss a single heartbeat. The fragile, mourning princess from the previous day was gone. She stood up, her pale face set in a mask of absolute, terrifying authority. The immediate political implication of the dead beast on the table was a weapon handed directly to her, and she wielded it with lethal precision. "Lord Vale." Lyra's voice rang out, cold and unyielding, echoing through the cavernous pavilion. "You have just smuggled a restricted biological weapon into the royal presence. You deployed it with the intent to murder a prince of the hive in full view of the High Court. This is not a test. This is an act of high treason and an undeniable assassination attempt." Vael sputtered, his telepathic voice panicked and fragmented. "Princess, I assure you, the beast was meant to be controlled. I did not intend to cause harm." "You do not have the right to speak," Lyra commanded, silencing him instantly. "By the sovereign right of the bloodline, I formally charge you with treasonous conspiracy. I am immediately stripping you of command over the northern garrisons. 50% of your military assets are forfeit to the crown, effective this exact second. If you or any of your loyalists utter a single word of protest, my husband will demonstrate what human blunt force trauma looks like on your skull." The noble lords sat completely frozen, terrified into submission. Vael was humiliated, bleeding, and politically castrated in the span of 60 seconds. The faction that had terrorized the royal family was suddenly shoved completely into a corner, trapped between the political brilliance of a supposedly weak princess and the terrifying, unstoppable brutality of a human monster. The retaliation came precisely at the darkest hour of the planetary cycle, driven to absolute desperation by the catastrophic humiliation at the banquet. Lord Vael and his fractured coalition of nobles abandoned all political maneuvering. They initiated a full-scale, violent coup. They did not use stealth. They used an ancient, forbidden piece of deep-crust technology, a massive psychic amplifier designed to focus the collective telepathic hatred of hundreds of nobles into a single, localized siege weapon. The attack hit the royal palace like an invisible, catastrophic earthquake. The queen's impenetrable mental shielding, an ancient barrier that had protected the royal bloodline for 1,000 solar cycles, shattered under the overwhelming pressure. Chaos immediately consumed the grand halls. The royal guards, the elite protectors of the throne, were instantly subjected to absolute mind control. Their eyes rolled back, glowing with a sickening crimson light, as Vial hijacked their motor functions. The palace descended into a slaughterhouse. Guards turned their heavy plasma rifles on one another, their bodies moving like mechanical puppets, while their trapped minds screamed in silent agony. The pristine, calcified bone corridors were quickly painted with viscous blue blood. Ashton and Lyra found themselves completely surrounded in the vast, vaulted expanse of the main hall. They stood back to back, forming a tight defensive perimeter. Dozens of mind-slave soldiers marched forward in perfect, terrifying unison, raising their weapons. The heavy biological doors at the far end of the hall ripped open. Lord Vale stepped through, his jagged crimson armor still heavily scorched from the boiling blood of his failed assassin. He was flanked by 10 of his most powerful telepaths. A cruel, triumphant sneer warped his featureless face. "You rely too heavily on your crude metal, human," Vial projected, his voice booming through the air, heavy with the weight of hundreds of linked minds. "You think a blade and a few explosives can stop an entire army? We control the very thoughts of the soldiers pointing their weapons at your chest. Your physical violence has a mathematical limit. Our collective will does not. You will die right here, and the princess will finally serve her purpose in chains." Ashton did not raise his weapon. He simply stood there, his synthetic arm resting casually at his side. A low, harsh sound echoed through the silent, tense hall. It took Vale a moment to realize the human was laughing. "You really do not understand how a network functions, do you?" Ashton asked, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You think you are gods because you can whisper in each other's heads. But a network is just a series of open doors. And when a door is left wide open, anyone can walk inside." Vial paused, a flicker of genuine confusion disrupting his telepathic projection. "What are you talking about?" "During the wedding ceremony," Ashton explained, taking a slow step forward, completely ignoring the plasma rifles aimed at his head. "When I touched your precious source tree, I did not just feed your network my bad memories. I used the psychic link to upload a localized payload directly into your biological router. A digital parasite translated into a neural frequency." Lyra glanced at Ashton, her silver eyes widening in sudden realization. "You nobles are all connected right now, are you not?" Ashton smiled, and this time, the smile was purely lethal. Linked through the amplifier, a single, massive, undefended mainframe. Ashton raised his left arm. He did not aim a weapon. He simply extended his metallic index finger and tapped a single, physical key integrated into the armor plating of his forearm. He executed the command. The cyber virus activated. It was a piece of military-grade malware, originally designed to paralyze hostile supercomputers, now perfectly adapted to infect the Xyloc hive mind. The payload did not attack their bodies. It attacked their bandwidth in a fraction of a millisecond. The virus flooded the noble telepathic network with petabytes of corrupted, rapidly multiplying junk data. It forced their interconnected brains to simultaneously process infinite, contradictory mathematical algorithms, blinding white noise, and the raw, digitized screaming of a dying star. The effect was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The mind-slave soldiers dropped their weapons simultaneously. They collapsed to the floor, violently seizing as the neural link holding them hostage suddenly overloaded and burned out. Across the hall, the 10 powerful telepaths flanking Vale shrieked in unison. Blood violently erupted from their sensory visors and their ears. They fell to their knees, clawing frantically at their own heads, trying to physically rip the connection out of their skulls. But the virus was already deeply embedded in their neural pathways. Their brains were literally cooking under the sheer volume of information overload. Vial staggered backward, his hands desperately clutching his armored head. A horrifying, gurgling scream tore from his throat. The invincible collective he relied upon had just been turned into a localized explosive charge inside his own mind. He was completely blinded, completely deafened, and entirely paralyzed by the digital agony. "Move!" Ashton ordered. Lyra did not hesitate. As a null, the catastrophic telepathic screaming echoing through the network did not affect her in the slightest. She stepped forward, her elegant morning dress flowing around her, and calmly picked up a heavy kinetic pistol from the hands of a seizing guard. Ashton drew a massive, human-made kinetic revolver from his hip. They walked side by side, a terrifying picture of total immunity, striding through the writhing, screaming mass of the noble faction. They did not run. They took their time. They reached the steps where Viel had fallen. The mighty lord of the nobles was on his hands and knees, weeping thick blue tears, completely incapable of forming a single, coherent thought. Lyra looked down at the creature who had murdered her husband. There was no pity in her silver eyes, only the cold, unyielding void of space. She leveled her weapon. "Simple physics, Vale," Ashton whispered, raising his own revolver to align with hers. They fired simultaneously. The deafening roar of primitive, expanding chemical propellants echoed through the grand hall. Two heavy, armor-piercing tungsten slugs shattered Viel's crimson plating and tore straight through his skull. The lord of the nobles collapsed face first onto the polished floor, completely lifeless. The coup was over. A meticulously planned, planetary-scale rebellion had been completely eradicated in under 3 minutes by the asymmetric, deeply cynical technological warfare of a single human being. From the high balcony overlooking the main hall, Queen Xylock stepped out from the shadows. The ambient glow of the palace slowly began to stabilize as the infected network shut itself down to purge the virus. The queen stared down at the carnage, her featureless face turning toward Ashton. She had wanted a monster to scare her rivals. She realized, with a profound, icy dread settling deep in her core, that she had fundamentally misunderstood the creature she brought into her home. He was not a blunt instrument. He was the architect of an entirely new, terrifying era. Hours later, the subterranean winds howled softly against the high spires of the royal palace. Ashton and Lyra stood together on the grand balcony, looking out over the sprawling, bioluminescent capital. The city was silent, completely pacified by the sudden, brutal shift in power. Lyra reached out, her pale fingers gently resting against the cold, unyielding metal of Ashton's cybernetic arm. She did not look at him with disgust, nor did she look at him with the terror her mother possessed. She looked at him with the profound respect of a survivor recognizing an apex predator. They were no longer outcasts. They were no longer pawns forced into a desperate, blood-soaked marriage. As they stood above the glowing, subjugated world, watching the hive slowly bow to a new, terrifying authority, they knew the truth. They were the undisputed masters of the empire, ruling not through the elegant whispers of a shared mind, but through the cold, calculated, and absolute certainty of human dominance. Thank you so much to all the wonderful listeners for tuning in to the conclusion of our story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please let us know in the comments below. If you found today's story thrilling and want to support our channel, please consider donating just $1. You can do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment. Your support helps us pay our hardworking staff so they can feed their families and continue creating even better stories for you. Thank you again.